Thank you for joining this installment of the Dubb Action Online Summit. Today I have with me David Smailes. We're going to get into the idea and the topic of how the best leaders on the planet hold themselves and others accountable. Now, this is a really interesting topic because accountability has taken on a lot of different forms in the last several years. I think a lot of focus has been turned away from us and towards us as leaders. There's a great example of leadership that showcases the idea of when we want to provide gratitude, we put it outward towards our team. But when we want to put blame, we put it on ourselves as the leader. Now that's a little tough, but it really, I think, in my opinion, is a good example of how we can hold ourselves accountable, especially when things go wrong. So David, if you could start with a short bio, and then let's get into this topic.
Sure. David Smailes. So thank you for having me on the show. I love what you said about leadership. It reminds me of the book Extreme Ownership, where the Navy SEALs blame themselves even for the rain. And so they essentially say, if it's raining and we haven't planned adequately for that, then it's on us. So right. I do leadership development for CHG Healthcare. I also teach a class at a university close by. So I get a chance to use my students sometimes as lab rats to test some content on, but it's a lot of fun teaching students some leadership skills and communication skills. Nice. So it's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Yeah. That example that you presented is a very anti-Milli Vanilli approach, because their famous song from back in the day was "Blame It on the Rain." and here in your example, it's take ownership or blame ourselves for the rain if we're not prepared. So you've done a number of things on this topic. You've held keynote roles. You've been on podcasts. Give us that sort of quick social proof. Why should we listen to you? Why are you the expert on this topic? And where have you sort of been featured?
Yeah, so I'm almost done with my doctorate at Vanderbilt University, where I'm studying this. So I'm not only just applying it with leaders, and I'm the director of leadership development for about 150 leaders. So this is something I do. I go to bed thinking about this stuff. I wake up thinking about this. So for me, it's always on my mind. And I like that you referenced social proof, which is one of the 6 principles of persuasion, right? As far as persuading others to do something. So I've been highly successful at launching a coaching program for all the leaders in the 40-year history. No one's ever launched a formal leadership development program for our company. So I've had the chance to do that successfully with a high NPS score, and we're doing a lot of great things. And so it's one of those things that I find highly applicable, but at the same time, I see a lot of leaders struggle, and they're trying to find some kind of GPS system to navigate them through these perilous waters. And so there's just a lot of opportunity out there to help leaders.
Nice. Well, you said you go to bed thinking about leadership, which means you're in bed with leadership. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, you could say that.
Okay. I just did. Okay, so let's talk about coaching skills.
All right.
Now, as a leader, we are an educator, right? And our goal as leaders is to put other people on a pedestal and to rise them up. That's when we can rise as leaders. So how can we be better coaches?
Wow, it's a big question, right? Like, being better coaches is sometimes, like, I think it's one, defining what it is and what it's not, right? It's easy to tell people what to do as a leader, especially if you've done the job. And so I noticed that if you have short-term targets, the coaching process becomes a lot harder. So really, coaching is helping people reach their potential. And that is through the ability to ask questions, provide feedback, provide expectations, and be really clear about it, but also focus a lot on the relationship. I mean, you talk about empathy quite a bit. It's really being able to say, I genuinely care about your development, not just the numbers. And the more leaders can overlap those two aspects of leadership, which is essentially like, I care about you as a person, and I also care about you so much, I want to help you reach a standard. That's the key. I mean, any leader can drive results and just say, this is all we're going to do. And then any leader can really drive relationship building, but not the results. But the key to leadership is being able to do both. So coaching skills is the ability to build relationships and hold people accountable to a standard.
That makes sense. Now, give me some of the characteristics of leaders, and specifically accountable leaders.
Yeah, one is just a high emotional intelligence. I think that, and what I mean by that can seem vague, but it's kind of a soundbite at this point. But I would say people who who see the world and they recognize reality and they help other people recognize the same reality. Where I see problems is when this person that they're trying to help sees reality differently and the leader sees it one way, but they're not aligning on that same reality. So it all starts kind of with this aspect of being able to see reality and then helping somebody else see what's possible as well. But they also can do it in a way that engages the person as an individual, not necessarily as an employee.
Now, you mentioned empathy. Take us through how we can be more empathetic leaders, but at the same time, hold ourselves and others accountable. That seems like a challenging balance. Guide us through that.
Gosh, it is a challenging balance. So I always say, how well do you see this person? And we really say it starts with listening. And if you look at the top attributes of the top performing salespeople, and if you look at academic journals and say, what are the top characteristics of top performers in sales, you'll see that listening typically is at the top. In fact, it's almost every single time at the top. And the same applies to leadership. So if you have the ability to listen and observe and see your people individually, then you can bring that into play. I'll give you an example. So from what I can tell, you like to travel. What I can tell, you also play musical instruments. It looks like you play the drums and you play guitar, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I would take that as an example and say, okay, Ruben, have you ever been in a band before?
I have, in fact.
Okay. Have you had struggles with the different people in the band in terms of aligning on a particular goal or objective?
Yes.
Okay. So if I can bring something that's personal to you and bring it into play with something that you're struggling with at work and try to frame it in a way that this challenge that you're facing could be something that you've dealt with on the outside and help frame it for you that way. And then we can talk about how do we move forward with a standard or accountability measure. Then you feel like I'm not just pushing a number on you, but I'm actually seeing you for who you are. And now I'm driving performance, and you feel better about the idea that you and I have a partnership, as opposed to here's the standard, here's where you are, let's close the gap. Any leader can do that. In fact, I can manage your team with Excel if that were all leader, if that's what's leadership. Sorry, I'm getting hit up on my chat here. But in reality, if I can say, okay, tell me about a time when you were in a band and you struggled with bringing somebody along, how'd you hold that person accountable? What are some things you did? And if you were able to say that, then it looks like you're about to answer. So I don't want to interrupt the flow there. So go for it.
Well, I think the ask of the band in this case was to the other person, can you please stop drinking that much?
Okay. Okay. So how did you do that? Because he's a person you genuinely care about, right? Or she. You genuinely want to keep that relationship intact to get the performance out of that person. So how did you do that?
Right. Well, there was an oxymoron in this case, because the person that would host the sessions had a big, beautiful bar. So it was almost like you shouldn't drink, but then here's a bunch of drinks that you should try. So it was like the communication was completely defunct and, paradoxical. Right.
You're almost swimming against the current at that point. You're trying to tell them one thing, but the environment is set up to take them down the other way, right?
Right. And as the drummer, my job is to keep the beat. So I need to make sure that if the beat's gone, the song's gone. A song can survive without the guitar, without vocals, bass, and so on and so forth. But without a beat, everything falls apart. So my syncopation, my cadence needs to be spot on. So I'm very sensitive to that. I will notice things like that. And I think it just really comes down to clear, I think, to your point, expectations.
That's right. So if you and I have the ability to align on reality, then really just accountability is you and I being able to make sure, are we seeing things the same way?
Yeah.
If you and I agree to this,
things the same
are we hearing this? Yeah. And if we're not aligned, then let's align. And then in the future, you and I can come back to this reality. Where I see things go really off is when you and I have different versions of that reality. And so, and if, to use your phrase, right, a good listener would say, keep the beat. And so if you're struggling in your performance, Ruben, I'd say, how do we keep the beat here?
Right.
What is something we can do in this sales role, assuming we're doing sales, to keep this beat moving, and letting you come up with some solutions, and you and I agree to this reality, and then you and I can talk about what that looks like in the future.
Right.
Hopefully that's humanizing numbers in a way it's bringing magic to the mundane, is what I say.
Right. And I think what's really interesting about this is that self-realization is really challenging. And there are so many things in our lives that can block self-realization, whether it's, chemicals, whether it's our ego, whether it's, speaking too much and not listening enough. There are so many different ways that we can ultimately say, I've lost a connection to who I am, what my hopes, what my fears are, what my strengths, what my weaknesses are. And by losing that connection to the self, ultimately what we do is we lose our potential, but I also think that we lose ultimately our happiness, and that's a slippery slope.
Yeah, and I find that as you ascend in leadership, the combination of ego, insecurity, and authority or power really is a bad elixir. And what you need to do is keep really great feedback loops open and surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth. Because I find that as leaders ascend, there's those feedback loops change and they get told things that I don't necessarily think is true sometimes. So it's about that reality that I brought up earlier. Can you align on the reality in your self-development, and your self-awareness is going to be critical as you ascend, and you need to surround yourself with people who tell it to you straight.
Okay, so let's explore that. Let's unpack that a little bit. One of the challenges that I think that takes place in social media, in a general sort of any familial kind of friendly environment, is that when we make ourselves vulnerable, when we try something and we go and we ask for feedback from our loved ones and our friends, that a lot of the times the first instinctual reaction is for that person to just be encouraging for us, to say positive things, to pat us on the back. And I don't want to say that it's sometimes dishonest, but sometimes the goal is just to make us feel good and make us feel confident, as opposed to being actionable with really hard feedback. Now, I sort of I always try to find my balance in saying I don't want to make a person feel discouraged. I want them to feel empowered and confident, but at the same time, I want to be very specific about my feedback, and I also want to pre-qualify my feedback to say, listen, I know about this topic, I don't know about this topic, and to make sure that they can take my feedback for what it's worth, which is most of the time $0 and 0 cents. So my question for you is, how can we, as vulnerable people, as risk takers, how can we really ask for that cold, hard feedback so that we can legitimately improve and go through the iteration cycles?
Wow. Yeah. I think giving them permission to do it by saying, hey, I recognize I have a tendency to do this. And so what that does is it primes the feedback loop, as opposed to, hey, give me feedback. That's a harsh transition for somebody, because all of a sudden it's risky. It feels like the stakes are high. So by saying, hey, I have a tendency, I know, to talk too much, or I have a tendency to offer way too many solutions. And am I doing that right here? And then you start to prime. And sometimes I tell people, you're kind of like hitting yourself in the face a little bit, which gives them a little bit of permission to give you some feedback. And it starts that connection, or at least it starts the dialogue of things that I could be doing to help improve this relationship. And but a lot of leaders just hey, I want your feedback. Well, help them out a little bit by saying, hey, I have a tendency to do this. What's good? Am I doing that to you right now? Like, can you help me out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Also,
really
you
great.
mentioned feedback, right? Like, we know that from a lot of research, there's a study, a very famous study, where it was a longitudinal study, but the way you give feedback can either tank performance or it can really help people perform. What they found is the more task oriented the feedback is, the better people tend to do with that feedback, as opposed to, let's say you're offbeat with the drums and me saying, hey, you're killing the rhythm here for the band. That's a lot harder for you to take because it's more personalized, meaning it's attached to the self, than for me to say, hey, you missed the beat right here in this section. It just seemed like we were a little bit off, or I was a little bit off, but this is where it seemed to go off, the beat. And you just did it too quick right here. It just seemed like the beat was a little fast, right? So now I'm making it task centric versus it's about you. It's like saying you left all the drawers open in the bathroom. You're a very inconsiderate person. Or that seems really inconsiderate. That's too hard for a lot of people to take because it's attached to the self. By saying, I noticed all the drawers were left open. It's almost removed from the self. And by doing that feedback in more a task-centric way, you get more performance or better performance out of people.
Now, there's a reference that I want to bring up real quick, which is the movie Whiplash.
Okay.
So I don't know if you've seen this film, but this
I'm
film,
not, but I've heard really great things about it.
okay, so this film is a really, it's so interesting to bring up this reference right here, because it's literally what you just said, but it's also metaphorically what you just said. So in this scene right here, what's happening here is that J.K. Simmons, the character here, he's smashing the young drummer here, the percussionist that's in the jazz band, and he's asking him a simple question: are you rushing or are you dragging? Which means, are you behind the beat or are you ahead of the beat? And he's basically antagonizing him. He's harassing him. He's being verbally abusive. In fact, he's actually being physically abusive. I think he threw some stuff across the room. This was a very poignant film. And the theme that they were getting at is this idea that to pull greatness out of someone, like this young drummer here, played by Miles Teller, that you have to be really, really harsh sometimes. You have to break a person down so badly that they respond with rage, that they say, I'm never going to let you treat me like that. I am the controller of my fate. I'm going to work my butt off. I'm going to be perseverant, and I'm going to overcome this challenge to ultimately become great. Now, again, a very controversial topic here.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
We've seen a lot of people in our society be treated like that. If you look at the Tiger Woods, if you look at the Williams sisters, the way that they were raised in sports was tough. It was not easy, and they got to great places, obviously. Not without repercussions, but of course they did get to greatness, right? So my question for you is, as leaders, how can we give tough love? And should we give tough love? Guide us a little bit on this.
Yeah, the best leaders have high standards. They also have high support, right? And so it's interesting. I was with my former college roommates in Las Vegas this last weekend, and I took a wrong turn. And my friend, who's known for being a little more critical, was just kind of hounding me. Hey, Smailes, you're making a wrong turn here. Where are we going? He just kept, and ironically, I kept making more mistakes navigating us to this destination. And I even said, hey, like, he's a principal of a school. I said, could you not do that? Like, ironically, the more or the less you call it out, the more likely I'm going to not make those mistakes. So he said, hey, like, he sat back and was like, hey, you're doing a great job driving. You're doing it. Like, he almost laid it on too thick. But at the same time, I was like, I started feeling a lot better about my ability to navigate this. I do think for the long haul, for the infinite game, as Simon Sinek calls it, we need to sustain great relationships. I see a lot of leadership skills where we do what you say in Whiplash. We drive performance for the short term. It can get you from here, Las Vegas, Salt Lake. I'm in Salt Lake. But you're in the red in terms of RPMs. You will burn out the engine. But yeah, it'll get you there quick. But if you want to make the long haul to New York, you're going to have to figure out a more balanced approach. And so to do that, you have to focus on the idea of this relationship. And in reality, it is, you mentioned in the beginning of this broadcast, is great gratitude. Genuinely appreciating what people bring, recognizing what they do, letting them feel like they can make mistakes while giving that feedback loop in a supportive kind of way that's task-centric. You start to drive performance. And as long as you guys can see reality the same way, and you're constantly talking about what's expected, but you see them, and I bring in personalized examples about you playing drums or you traveling and what it's like to travel, and I see you for who you are, magical things can happen because I'm overlapping those two aspects. Your need to feel like you matter and you have value, and also the need to perform, right? The more we overlap those, the more we have better performance and a sustainable model.
I really love that. The visual that came to my mind when you were presenting the driving example was this idea of when you're on a mountain bike, in fact. And let me just get a quick visual here. But I remember I was years and years ago, I was part of a mountain biking club. It was a night club. And the folks that were in this club, they all worked at bike shops. So these guys were like pretty much semi-pro, and I was not. So I just was trying to keep up a lot. And I remember that when I was on these single track trails, a lot of the times is that, especially if there was a cliff on one side, I would feel a lot of fear. And what I would do is I would look at that cliff and I would look at that drop off and say, oh crap, if I end up there, bad things are going to happen to me. And what was interesting is every time I would look not where I was supposed to go, but rather where I did not want to go, that's kind of where I would end up, right? And I'd have to make a correction if there was a fall, or if I was, veering off the trail, I'd have to correct myself. And I was telling this to someone, actually the leader of the group, and I said, hey, listen, sometimes I feel high amounts of fear and I get slow, and then when I get slow, I don't have momentum. I can't fly over some of the the bumps in the terrain, and it ends up being more challenging. And he gave me this simple advice, which I already knew, but it was really nice to hear in that very specific example, was that just look where you want to go. And when you look where you want to go, you're going to, first of all, physically speaking, your weight is going to center itself. It's your shoulders, your torso, your legs, your hands, your arms, everything is going to be directing on that single track trail. But more so, you're going to avoid the thought of failure. You're going to avoid fear, which ultimately can become a risk. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the saying, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. I'm not a huge fan of that quote. But in sometimes, and in some cases, in fact, it's the best feedback, because you want to avoid where you don't want to fall. And I think the same thing happens for leadership. In that example, a leader was coaching me on how to stay on the path, and ultimately it helped me. And I think it really helped me from a health perspective, also, from a leadership perspective.
Yeah, and that proverbial edge in sales is, if you don't hit your numbers, there's that possibility that you can fail. And having a leader constantly remind you of that, and having that feedback loop there, that's going to cause the person not to reach their full potential in their role, right? A leader says, yeah, that exists, but we're going to focus on just the aspect of mountain biking that's a lot more fun and exhilarating, which is this. If you keep focusing on that, we're not possibly going to reach our potential. So to your point, a leader they don't have to always remind you that there's an edge there. You do that pretty well on your own. It's this aspect of, hey, how do we have a great time? And how do we stay on this track? And they coach you through it.
Nice. Final question for you is, give us some tactical, some very actionable feedback on how we can be more accountable as leaders. What does that look like? Is there software? Is it interpersonal? Is it communication based? Guide us a little bit on just maybe one or two tips on how we can be better and more accountable.
Yeah, I'm honestly going to apply some of the same things that we're talking about here to myself. Like I say, well, what can I be doing better right now? I know I can be communicating faster. I mean, you probably know this by communicating with me over email. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by the amount of communication. And I think one thing you have to understand as a leader is response times equate to trust. Responsiveness equates to trust. And so I can almost guarantee in a lot of different ways how we communicate with people proactively as opposed to reactively. Results in instilled trust with your people. And then if you have more trust, you have a greater relationship. So tactfully, I would say just response times. How are they? And then have you set expectations in terms of what's adequate if they message you via chat or via email? But a lot of times I notice that what breaks down for a lot of people is this inability to communicate and to set expectations. Like I keep coming back to this aspect of setting expectations, and we're a little bit afraid to do it. The research tells us number one reason people don't set expectations is fear. We're afraid to turn this relationship that you and I have into something that's transactional, that's contingent on something. That's okay as long as you humanize it. And I say, hey, look, I value you intrinsically, but we also need to make sure we get to this point, right?
Love that. So where can people learn more about you, social channels, anything that you've done? I know that I'll be sharing a link to a podcast that you were on. Guide us a little bit on that, please.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn, I need to do a better job of this professionally in terms of putting my content out there. I'm so busy with getting my doctorate. I'm so busy by teaching and coaching leaders where I currently work. You mentioned that podcast that I did for Silicon Slopes. You can check me out there, but at the same time, I need to do a better job of putting myself out there. And because I think it would benefit a lot of people just by knowing some of the aspects of leadership that get most leaders stuck, that get most leaders hung up on trying to help their people as much as they can.
Nice. Well, I shared the link to that podcast, and also we've shared your LinkedIn profile in the comments. I wanted to thank you, David, so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I feel like a better leader already.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Thanks so much. Stick around for some production notes. Thanks.
You got it.